Hello, I'm Farida Rustamova, founder of the FORA Gallery, and I'm glad to be hosting this conversation. At the FORA, our focus is contemporary artistic practices emerging from the Caucasus and Central Asian regions, where post-colonial realities and the shifting cultural identities intersect in a complex way. We're very pleased to be joined in this conversation today with the Princess Alia Al-Senussi, a cultural strategist, advisor, and a patron whose works engage closely with a similar question, particularly in relation to the MENA region and more broadly with the concept of cultural diplomacy and social influence of agency.
Hello, thank you so much to Farida and to FORA Gallery for hosting this podcast. My work has really spanned what we now call the global majority, something I've been very passionate about in terms of also thinking the overlapping ways of art, culture, power, agency, social constructs, political constructs, and the ways in which we see ourselves through art and culture. I have lived in London for my entire career, 20 years, since I graduated from university, and then moving here for my master's, and then later on my PhD. But really because being in London is such almost like the global capital of the global majority, I guess one would say. And, from here have been able to have jumping off points to actually the various countries in the Central Asia and the Caucasus, of course, to the Middle East, where a majority of my work takes place, but as well as to Asia, where I just arrived from yesterday after Art Basel Hong Kong and other travels, and then as well as to the United States and elsewhere.
It's very nice to host you here today, and I'm very happy to know you and to have a chance to talk to you. And let's start this conversation.
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you.
So we have several questions regarding the region and the ongoing situation right now. In several of your interviews and the public reflections, you point an ongoing recalibration of the global cultural geography, particularly in relation to the MENA region, growing visibility and agency within the art world. From your perspective, what institutional shifts have taken place in recent years and what cultural transformations are still required for a MENA to operate as a site of the institutional authority with a global art system?
So I'll take the second part of your question first because it's the easiest to answer. The number one thing that needs to happen in order for the Arab world, for MENA, for MENASA, and indeed for the global majority in general, to really take a center of gravity in the art world is to be involved in the market. And unfortunately, that is still the one building block that is lacking. There isn't yet a huge collector engagement, a huge market engagement in that global majority world in the MENASA region. For the first part of your question, that's of course much more nuanced. And it has been, for me, it's been 20 plus years. But of course, it's been over several decades that we have seen a really concerted effort made by grassroots arts organizations, by artists and patrons, creating things, for example, like Edge of Arabia in Saudi Arabia, or Badoon Collective, let's say more Levantine in Persian. And then you have what's happening in Dubai that really started in 2005, 6, 7, and the greater UAE with the announcement of Saadiyat Island. And so, of course, the Guggenheim, which is hopefully opening at the end of this year or early next year. And, of course, Louvre Abu Dhabi, less involved with the contemporary art world, but, of course, as a very important institution. And then you have different arts organizations initiatives around the region having done so much. And really, this is through mostly artists, as well as curators, patrons, and cultural practitioners. And then more recently, with Saudi Arabia and Vision 2030, you have seen this huge expansion of what people think about the Gulf in particular, but also about the Arab world and the wider region and their cultural engagement, as well as what that means in the context of the art world ecosystem.
Discussion around the emerging art ecosystem often focus on their position within the global platforms and institutions. From your perspective, how can such ecosystem move beyond being framed as a thematic or regional case studies and instead operate as active contributors to authors of a global contemporary artistic discourse?
Well, I actually think for the Diriyah Contemporary Art Biennale has been such an important part of the shift in what we think of in the global art world, because it has been a platform, of course, first and foremost for Diriyah, for the Saudi people, for Saudi artists and practitioners, but as much about putting them in conversation with their global counterparts, as well as bringing those global counterparts to Saudi and providing a platform that forces them to see a world beyond, London, New York, Milan, Paris, etc. If anything, it reminds me of actually the early days of Art Basel Hong Kong and what continues with Art Basel Hong Kong. And actually the Diriyah Contemporary Art Biennale has definitely been very much that. And also encompassing a lot of artists from Central Asia, a huge conversation actually between the Diriyah Biennale Foundation and Uzbekistan, with lending this incredible, the Musalla Prize, which was a prayer space that went to the very first Bukhara Biennial. And to be in Bukhara, the heart of the Silk Road, and thinking that you see a prayer space from Saudi created by a Lebanese architectural team, curated by a global team, that actually is the ancient Silk Route. That is how we have the most diverse, foods and religious patterns and trade and spices and clothing and all of it. And I think that conversation, when we see this global shift happening, when we go to a place like Bukhara, we come to a place like Diriyah, you see the world in a more ancient way, if anything, not even a contemporary way. And these trades and these silk routes have been going on for millennia, not even centuries, millennia, of the ways in which we trade culture and power.
You have actively pushed back against the narratives that position emerging region as starting from zero. In the context of rapid institutional acceleration present in the region, how important is to assert historical depth and what mechanisms are required to preserve that cultural memory? To what extent can modernization process actually unintentionally erase the cultural heritage?
Well, I think that the concept that everything happening right now in the Middle East is new is inherently racist. And I absolutely reject it. And I have said this often in some of my talks and speeches. No, it is not a new civilization. It is not a new people. I was reminded of this actually by somebody who said, well, don't forget what happened with Chinese contemporary art in the 90s. And there was a very famous story, and it's a true story, of a collector offering to a prominent museum in Los Angeles, a Museum of Contemporary Art, LA, which has one of the great collections of postmodern art of the 20th century, Western postmodern art of the 20th century. And they offered him, the famous museum director, contemporary Chinese art. This was mid-90s, I think. And the museum rejected it, saying there's no contemporary art coming from China. First of all, that is an insane thing to say. Second of all, how arrogant and how racist. I cannot get over so many good people who I see and respect who just want to reject China or reject the Arabs or reject Central Asia or reject what's happening in the world because they think, they just see money somehow or they see it as being manipulated. And they forget that there are real people and civilizations. There's people behind that. Exactly. Exactly. There are people behind that and there's culture behind that. And, for so long, one would fight against it. And now I think I feel, and so many of my colleagues and friends feel, forget the engagement. The engagement's done. Here we are. This is real. Get on board. And if you want to continue to reject it, then you can be left behind.
Within a global art system, who ultimately define the region narratives? Curators, market, collectors, institutions, or the region itself? How it's managing right now?
Really, the artists are absolutely at the forefront. I would say the one thing, as I mentioned before, that we are lacking is perhaps a real market push. So there's only a handful of galleries, very few collectors, and really almost no collectors that are really engaged in market conversations. So buying, these very high-priced works of art at auction, engaging with galleries, on multi-million-dollar sales. You see very little of that. And I do think that that's unfortunate. As much as I am not involved in the market, I do appreciate that the market is an important arbiter of how we view culture. And of course, we want artists to be able to make a living. We need to make sure that collectors are buying their art in order for them to be able to pay their rent and live and make and do. And I'm a very big believer in the gallery system. So I say, well done you for starting a FORA gallery, because we do need galleries that shine a light on artists and work with artists to help them connect with institutions, collectors, and more. Because we do see artists on a national stage, artists on an international stage, and the ways in which galleries have been so important of actually helping support them and get them to that point. And I think that for the Middle East and Asia, the idea of what the market sees helps justify investment into it. And I don't just mean financial investment, I mean governmental investment. You know, when Vision 2030 will be a success. I am completely biased because I have been very involved in Tate since, very early in my career and my days in London. But I really believe in it as an institution. I believe that Tate has made our art world more global. It has made our world more global. And the fact that Tate Modern opened at the turn of the century, so at the millennia, and showed us that art, what is their tagline? It is art from around the world, free and open to the public, or something like very similar to that. That people can come in this incredible city we call London, my home, this global cosmopolitan world, and people visiting, people who live here, can go and see themselves reflected in Tate. And we often think about that in the US right now, especially I think with President Obama, when the portraits came out, the famous Kenda Wiley portrait and the Amy Sherald of Michelle Obama. And you had this famous picture of a little Black girl looking at Michelle Obama's portrait, and she's seeing herself and being so excited. And I think we see that in London. You walk into the Tate and you see yourself. You see works from around the world based around theme. So you see the horrors of war. You see the horrors of injustice, but then you see the joys of beauty. And it's not, oh, here's your Islamic room. Here's your Central Asian room. Here's your Japanese room. No. There's no theme in that way, but there are themes around universal values, moments of shift in the global narrative of what art and the art market could be, or what art could be, and what global art meant. I mean, I remember early days when I first was invited on a collector's patrons trip to Abu Dhabi. It was probably 2006-07. And there was a group of very important Americans, one of the most important collecting couples, and I won't name names. And they just said to me, they're like, oh, why is all of this Middle Eastern art so political? Why is it all about politics and war? Why can't it just be about the concept? And this, to me, it was like, because that's how people grew up. If you grew up in Lebanon,
reality.
Exactly, in the 70s and 80s, that's what your work is about. And funnily enough, this couple has now become an incredibly important force for Black art in America, and super political, because they couldn't see it before. And now they see it. I'll give people that sense of, maybe I hope for them that they can change their minds. Some people just don't, but a lot of people I still maintain hope for, that they can see beyond themselves. Because a lot of it is they can only see within their small circle, within their community. Oh, Rothko. Oh, Robert Rauschenberg. Sponsored by the CIA and the Venice Biennale. I mean, it's a fact. Yeah. So, also all of these people now are like rejecting, oh, look at the Middle East. It's all top down. It's just government sponsorship. It's art washing. I completely reject that term. Art washing, sport washing, any of it. This is about people wanting to represent who they are and explain to the world who they are. It is not about washing or manipulating anything.
Post-colonial regions, such as Caucasus, Central Asia, MENA or MENASA, are often framed through the geopolitical narratives that simplify their cultural complexity. Structural approaches allow this region to present themselves as more nuanced than the self-defined ways within the global art world. It's actually, I think, very related to the thing that you speak about, simplifying this region as a region, as a culture, as a region that has an identity and a history behind. So how it can be managed, how they can self-define the ways to be in global art.
I think it's just about doing it. I think it's about making moments where you can talk through things with each other, conferences, cultural weekends, gallery weekends, biennales. And I think actually those are really important moments of self-reflection because they also allow you to see, what does the public respond to? What does the community respond to? How can you do it in an intellectual way, but how can you also appeal to a larger public? I think that's really important. I mean, even sitting here and talking to you, it's also a moment for me to reflect and think about the work that I'm doing and, perhaps then take away from it, what is the next step? How do we make these platforms for each other? How do we encourage different people to engage? Those are really key moments. And I think actually in the Caucasus you had, of course, now in our region is very female-led, comes from perhaps that sense of empathy or idea of soft power, as opposed to hard power. When I was doing my PhD, a lot of people were like, well, what exactly is soft power? The idea of soft power is completely gone. But yet what made America so great, or at least we say what made America so powerful in the world, was actually the soft power. The musicians and the artists and the institutions that went around the world helping the hard power, the hard industry dominate global trade. But it was really winning people's hearts and minds over. And so we actually see that much more in terms of the way women lead.
If we speak about the women in leadership position, we also see there's many women leaders from the region who lead this region in the global art scene. From your perspective, how does this visibility influence both local and international perception of the region's cultural landscape? And to what extent does it translate into meaningful changes within the institutional culture?
Physical and, let's say, is actually one of the only key changes of making people really understand the shifts that are happening in the Middle East. Physically bringing a human body to Saudi Arabia and making them see with their open eyes the changes that are happening in a place. Some people still continue to reject that, and they are so hardened in their head with a prejudice of the Arab world, of Arab women, that they can't see past that. But that has, to me, only happened once or twice out of the hundreds of people that I have brought to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to Qatar. You bring people there, their minds are expanded. Their minds are so open and fundamentally changed to what they believed an Arab woman to be, or what they believed the Arab world to be, or what they believed Arab men to be like. And
yeah, it's totally different scene, totally different reality when you go and visit these places and you see how people live there, how they actually interact with their families, how the women respected in the Arab world. It's completely different what they show us on the media or how they
100%.
present this region to us, and see the role, like a woman in the leading role right now is such inspiration to me.
I've received a couple of messages from people that are just so beautiful and acknowledging of their own prejudice prior, and how they were able to shift and how they were able to just change their minds and really open themselves to this new reality. It's bringing people there physically and interacting with local communities and making sure they meet the right artists and they meet the right friends. And I don't mean right in the sense of, oh, there's a wrong or right. No, it's like you matchmake people.
As we said about politically tense environment, cultural institutions often operate between demands of cultural diplomacy and the need to maintain institutional independence. Can culture sustain dialogue where political communication breaks down, or does it risk becoming instrumentalized?
Of course, culture can be instrumentalized. Of course, culture can be weaponized. But when we look at the culture that takes hold in perpetuity, it is not that. We can take the American Pavilion in Venice as an example. I can guarantee you that this artist representing America in this Biennale will only be remembered as an instrument of this horrible American government in this moment. This artist is not going to be remembered and celebrated. We think of Robert Rauschenberg and actually how he was instrumentalized by the state. But that was a state and a State Department and a CIA and a government that understood actually what soft power was and understood the power of great art to change world opinion. So it's both sides and both things. I think that, you see right now actually in Saudi Arabia, the government realizes they have great artists and they have great cultural practitioners. And yes, they are using them and utilizing them
Soviet Union and how they instrumentalized the people for the revolution to happen. So main tool was the art, the artists. It's Malevich and all the group of people who stand for a revolution and made it happen. And the art became a main tool for the
and Malevich changed the way we see art in the world.
Huge moment that everything's changed.
And sometimes people who understand art and sometimes people who don't. I think in every case we see situations, absolutely, it depends on who's in power, I suppose, and who has that nuanced understanding of power and of culture and of cultural practitioners.
I wanted to mention the Bukhara and the Art Basel Qatar. They have a common and a very unique model. So very involved the architecture, the art, culture, heritage, and the history, craftsmanship, and there was a common and unique curatorial plan. And what you could say about that? How was that? And in your view, what allowed this model to function as a structurally grounded one?
So the Bukhara Biennial was one of the single most eye-opening and revolutionary moments of my adult life, I would say. Having never been to Uzbekistan and translated culture, amongst traders to each other, and then that proliferates out into society. And Qatar, having really understood also that sense of what does soft power mean? How do you develop a modern nation state, but looking at these moments of trade and exchange in history, but also how you want to bring people to where you are and translate who you are to them. Were really fascinating moments. And then again, also with the Diriyah Contemporary Art Biennale and the Islamic Arts Biennale, these are actually all three extraordinary women at the head of all of them, and women who all know and respect each other and like each other and have been in the same room with each other, have that sense of collaboration and exchange, and a healthy sense of how do we work together, but how do we make things unique? How do we borrow from each other, and how do we inspire each other, but also how do we make things new? So the Bukhara Biennial was a really important moment for me. Artists who are experiencing and experimenting with techniques related to craft, with textile, and this is back on the world stage. So Bukhara took that to the next level by also wanting to elevate people in trade in Uzbekistan who are very much craftsmen, right? So less what we would think of a traditional artist, but a great brick layer, a great carpet maker. But how do you put them in conversation with great artists to make then great art? And then also for others to realize this can be a career, that this can be a way to help, make a living, translate it to your family, do things that you love, make things that are beautiful, make things that are interesting. And that was a very interesting for me in Bukhara. And then you see that also in Qatar with a lot of the fashion initiatives.
And can be applied to other part of the region, or you prefer to be them more unique, more like belong to that part and make it like historical spots to host these events, and or it's the model that can be applied to other regions as well?
Well, I think Art Basel Qatar case in the sense that it's an art fair. I don't prescribe to or believe that we need an art fair in every city.
Yeah.
I think that you can have selling platforms, you can encourage galleries to do different types of things, gallery weekends. I don't think that an art fair needs to exist in that same format. But I do see something like a Bukhara Biennial, like the Diriyah Contemporary Art Biennale, those having spaces or having perhaps satellites or even other cities taking those models and making them their own. Because a biennial or an art festival can be just about the community. It doesn't have to be about the whole world coming, but it can be about that community and then how that community proliferates out into the world. But Art Basel Qatar is an incredible platform because it brings everyone there for that moment. And it brings the international art world there for that moment. I think Art Basel, to me, is absolutely the world's leading art fair platform, but also really art fair and art brand. Because, of course, great museums, Tate, MoMA, Pompidou, Louvre, but people don't travel, many people don't travel from around the world to go to a museum show opening. They'll go visit that museum when they're in that city to go see the show, but they're not going to travel for the opening in masses. While for an art fair, the focus is on that city in that moment. So you have thousands of people flying in to engage with each other also. And so to interact with each other in that context. And that is what an art fair does, that platform. that eyes on that city and on that place in that moment.
So such interesting ecosystem is creating around the art fairs. That's very interesting, yeah.
This idea of socializing and having a conversation offline, and you never know what that may lead to, is a really important way for people to develop in their careers and also develop in their social lives.
It's also helped the artists to be seen. And the more young people, more young audience are coming and seeing, and you're making that more flexible and welcoming, like a welcoming environment. It makes the art, it's more chance for artists to be seen, more chance for a fair to be seen. And I love the Art Basel Qatar and the Art Basel Basel. I really enjoy being there and part of that because the Basel is a very calm city. There's nothing happen usually, but when there's a fair, you can really see the vibe of the city. It's so flourishing.
And you appreciate the institutions, right? I mean, the Byler is one of the most beautiful museums in the world. And to see it filled with people who are all appreciating the beauty and the majesty of this place. And I call it majestic, even though it's like this chic, very pristine Swiss building. But it's so special. And it feels comforting.
It seems like it's separated from all these conflicts and all these problems.
Absolutely. The people that I know in it and who hold the same things I hold dear, have the same values. You know, and of course we don't agree about everything, but you agree certain things are fundamental.
I think the art is a tool for a people, for a history.
Of course, and then you read into it or you interpret it. Arthur Jaffa, a show of his, along with a show of Ali Sherry. It wasn't a joint show, it was two separate shows within the Bourse. And to see them there in that context, the ongoing attacks on Lebanon by Israel, about the ongoing attacks on Black Americans by President Trump, and to see that there was an absolute parallel, strong men in the world wanting to destroy minority or weaker kind of sects or people or ethnicities or religions. And it was so powerful to be in this museum that's built by one of the richest men in the world, one of the most important art collectors in the world, and who was given voice to this Lebanese man and this Black American man, and that they are both fighting back against these narratives of power, of oppression. I was like, this is why the art world is amazing. And this is why artists are the only thing that will save us in this time.
In a conclusion, if you were advising a cultural layered region today, what will be first structural priority? Is that could be education, governance, narrative control, or institutional capacity?
Empowering artists at a grassroots level. I think that is the number one thing I've seen that has given rise to the incredible work we see being done at an institutional level in Saudi, in Bukhara, in the Biennial, in Uzbekistan in general with the Contemporary Art Museum, CC Center for Contemporary Art, what we see happening in Hong Kong with these really important efforts for local artists, but as well as institutions. So it's only by empowering artists first are we then able to go to the next step of institutional celebrations. And even in places that started with incredible institutions, they are now also focusing on artists. So for example, in Qatar, that started with the Museum of Islamic Art, that is one of the most beautiful and incredible museums in the world with an astounding collection. So even now what you see happening in Qatar after the establishment of these incredible institutions is a focus on artists. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be that you start with the artists and then you build an institution. It can happen in different orders. But the fundamental building blocks of long-term cultural development, long-term cultural leadership is a focus on artists. And I think we definitely see that when we look at Uzbekistan, when we look at Saudi Arabia, when we look at the United States. And if anything, the problem now is a lot of artists in the US are working in isolation because institutions don't necessarily know how to support them given the current political structure. But you do have these incredible artists. I have not lost complete hope in the US yet because you do have these artists and you have these artists that are pushing back against the narratives. You see that in Saudi, as I said, you see that across Africa. I'm a founding member of the board of 154, and Africa is so vast. Unfortunately, because of the colonial legacy, you don't yet see really strong African institutions able to operate in isolation with each other. It has to always kind of be grouped together, and that's how the world wants to see it. But I think with Koyo Kuo's Venice Biennale, we are going to see a shift in that as well. And I only, wish and hope that Koyo would have been here to see it for herself, because that's what she championed. She wanted to see these different centers become their own centers and become their own places and not be part of the peripheries, but really be a part of core conversations. You see that through the power of artists. Sometimes the institutions come first, but then they empower the artists. And then later on, you see the market come. And I do really wish that we would have a big market moment outside of New York. And I'm hopeful for that.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the artists, they need to sustain their life.
Exactly.
And the market is very important as an institution, because institution can support at some point, but we should not forget that the artists, they are also human. They need to sustain themselves, and the art markets need to be shifted somehow, adjusted, and hopefully it will happen soon. Also, I wanted to ask about the colonization. There's many different types of the colonization around the globe. So there's the African, Indian, and the Latin America. How you think, what the common they have, and what's the differences in between this colonization in our matter, like in the region of the Central Asia, because we also experience decolonization now. This is the momentum when the artists can speak about their path, how the system vanished their culture and the history.
I just had the privilege of visiting Vietnam for the very first time. And especially being there at this moment where you see America going, again, an unjust war, was so eerie to see history repeat itself. But then what I found so extraordinary was that in Vietnam, they acknowledged, of course, the horrors of what happened with the Vietnam War with the United States. But in fact, they are more traumatized, or the people I became in contact with are more traumatized by their 100 years of French colonial rule. And that was almost who they had more anger towards, or many of our tour guides and people we talked to of absolute control. I think that the different colonial narratives, and it's something that I've been thinking about when I traveled in Africa, when I was in Senegal, when I was in Ghana, South Africa, different places. And when you hear about what happened in Congo, Morocco, Algeria, so many places.
Yeah.
And having especially really understood the horrors of what was perpetrated in Algeria, every country's colonial relationship have been so different. And it's a function of sometimes luck. You have a particularly brutal administrator. You have, unluckily or luckily, some resource that government or country wanted, rubber in the Congo, or gold, or whatever that resource may have been. And so certain cases of that colonial history then have remnants that are very different, and ripples that go through history in very different ways. And post-colonial narratives can be grouped together and generalized because we think of societies now being so much more connected, by the internet and by AI and by different tools that we're now developing. People are less isolated than they were before, so you can make more generalizations about a post-colonial narrative. But colonial experiences were so different.
Yeah.
It's actually our responsibility to remember those moments, because I think we see now there are certain cases of people feeling too far removed from what happened in their history, so then they are making the same mistakes that their ancestors made, or somehow wallowing, or then sometimes thinking that this problem is not theirs. So perhaps it's the responsibility of artists and then institutions to keep those things relevant, and you don't have to absolutely make everything in despair and wallow in the sadness.
There's no need to be aggression.
No. But it's to remember, we need to remember the bad things that happened so that we can prevent them happening again. And artists and institutions are in the best possible position to do that. Education doesn't seem to really work because so many people try to manipulate our textbooks or manipulate the information we have. So it's only through tools that somehow can't be changed. So looking at a painting, or, now we have the Bayeux Tapestry, this moment of English and French history that is a moment of reinterpretation, perhaps, for how we see the relationship of our tiny little island here with mainland Europe.
And how important to switch the collector's view to the Central Asian market and African and Middle East, because now, as we see, the huge collectors, the main collectors, they still focused on the global, like a Western artwork, like a Western community, art community. What should be done for a collector to switch their focus on the region that we're representing and we're talking about, and which patterns should be done or changed?
I think it's absolutely key that any collector building a global collection needs to make sure that that is actually reflected in the works that they have. A global art collection can't just be Western and African art. It can't just be Western and Middle Eastern art. It has to really encompass the globe. We are seeing that more and more in institutions. So I would say that it's actually the institutions that have been really showing private collectors the way and saying to them, you can't just look at, a white Western gaze. You need to expand that to, if you're in the United States, to also Black Americans, to Indigenous Americans, to women. You see that more and more in the great private collections. I was just at Glenstone in Potomac, just outside of DC. It's a very curated, small collection of mostly American artists, but as well artists that speak to a global world. Their concept is as well as collaborating with major institutions to bring those artists in conversation with each other. And you have now collectors that collect thematically. A lot of collectors, look at one topic or one type of art, so perhaps like textile art or ceramics, as well as around different themes of indigeneity or ethnicity or perhaps even religion. You have people who collect various types of Islamic art or Judaic art. And so I think the idea of collecting thematically is very important, but when you say it's a global collection, it must reflect the globe. Any collector that wants to do that does that, I think, through really seeing shows at museums, but also going to art fairs. So going to something like an Art Basel Qatar was such an eye-opener for quite a few people who I had as friends who were coming from the United States as well in particular. They felt that they learned so much. And then other collectors were like, oh, but we knew a lot of these artists. And that's wonderful too, because that sense of familiarity makes you realize perhaps you're on the right track. And I think that when you go as well to a biennial and you see things that are new in relation to artists that you know and are aware of, that's also somehow really comforting. It helps you put things into context and really look at things in an intellectual manner. So the idea of the market or building a collection related to a global art world is about, frankly, also air miles, just like getting on that airplane and getting out there, but also about conversations with people that you trust and respect who are out there in the global art world, and how you can find the right advisor or the right gallerist who can help translate that for you to your home or your community.
Yeah. So there is a more complex work, and everything needs to be supported on the same level, in the same way.
And you need to understand those artists' stories. So I think part of what we had said, also or what I had mentioned earlier about that collector couple who didn't understand why Middle Eastern artists, particularly Lebanese artists, were so fascinated by politics and by war, didn't understand the reality of living that. So I think it's also my obsession and my passion is how do you translate those stories to people to then make them appreciate the art even more. That is something that I love to do. And I also find really interesting and fascinating when I, go to a show or see that work of that artist, makes me appreciate it even more. For example, even Tracey Emin, arguably one of the world's most famous artists, if not the most famous living female British artist. I, of course, knew all about Tracey Emin and her neons, and I knew about her, her YBA life. But seeing her show at Tate and also having visited her foundation and her studios in Margate, which I just did this last summer, has given me a completely transformed view of her art. And frankly, all made me appreciate it a million times more.
So you start seeing from her perspective.
Completely. And appreciating her struggles and appreciating who she is and appreciating how much she's fought for me as a woman in this country and how much her work means
So there is such a reality as well.
Empathy, 100%.
I absolutely agree that it needs to be supported by the other people who is a patron in the art, navigate the collector and show them the way, to show them the reality, to speak to them and open their eyes to the realities and not just that's seen on the screen, but tell them more about what is on a background as a politics, as a life conditions and other realities of environment where the art is living, particularly from this region. Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you.
I hope everyone will like it. Thank you so much for your talk.